This is Mary Jeanette Smith House with my husband Harold, and we're going to put a few things, record a few things about our background for the kids, so they'll have something to share. Harold, do you want to talk about your grandparents first?
Okay. This is July 4th, 1988. We just got through swimming in our neighbor's pool with JP and Troy. Troy was a little bit afraid of the water, but JP takes to it like a duck. Anyway, it was very enjoyable. You want me to talk about my grandparents?
What were their names?
Well,
I think I know.
my great-grandfather's name was Andrew Searles. He was a merchant seaman, and he was a captain of the ship. It was a bark. That was the size of a ship. It was a merchant marine ship.
Do you know the name of it?
I don't remember the name of it. We have a picture of it.
It's not important.
Anyway, he brought the first dates, the fruit, into Boston Harbor. Then his son, who was my grandfather, didn't like the sea, so he came out west in search of his fortune. And his name was Andrew. And in fact, we have a goblet with his name on that was his. That is crystal. And it was given to my mother, and she passed it on to me.
Was he Andrew Jr.? Or the second?
I don't know if he was a junior or not. Anyway, they settled in Nebraska. And
From where?
from Boston.
But where were they originally?
Oh, originally from England. That's where my middle name came from.
Oh, okay.
Covington.
That's right. Okay.
Anyway, they settled in Nebraska around Bloomfield. And my grandmother's family was named Hayford. Andrew married Viola Hayford, who was my grandmother, of course. And on the farm,
This is in Bloomfield.
they started their farm from the prairie. And horses were very priceless, and there were a lot of rattlesnakes. And my grandmother used to go ahead of the horses with a stick and beat so that the snakes wouldn't bite the horses as they cleared the land.
Pretty gutsy.
Anyway, as time went on, they were successful, and they began to acquire animals and things of that nature. Then my grandfather was killed by a bull in Grandma Searles and had 3 children. One was my mother, who was the oldest, and that was Alice Gertrude. One was a son, and that was Frank Searles. And the youngest was Grace.
How old roughly was your grandfather at that point?
I really don't know. He was probably in his late 30s.
So relatively young
Mhm.
children.
So that's about all I knew until such time as, well, then my grandmother moved to Boyd County,
Nebraska?
Nebraska.
Why did she move?
Well, I guess the opportunity was greater or something. She sold what she had, and then the three children helped her run the farm. And my mother became a school teacher. She went to school and became a school teacher. And
Your mother taught school?
oh yes,
I didn't know that.
oh she did.
I didn't know that either.
Yeah.
Your mother was which one?
Alice Gertrude.
Did she go to college?
Well, I don't know. She had a teaching.
I guess maybe
Degree.
in those days they didn't need it.
Because by then, this would have been. Do you remember when your mother was born?
Well, I haven't. It's in the Bible in there.
Well, how old was she when you were born?
I don't know exactly.
I mean, roughly.
I don't
In
know.
her 20s?
Anyway,
Yeah.
Probably born in 1873.
in the summertime, she used to help her brother till the crops and put up the hay and all of those things. And then Grace was getting older, so she could start helping. And then later on, after teaching school in the summer, Mother got a job in a creamery. And she was a bookkeeper in the creamery. And that's when she met my father.
No, I think I'll tell you a little bit about mine now, if that's all you remember about it. My grandparents were Emily and Otto Kerner, Koerner. They had about 8 children, but all of them died except 3 in Germany. And as it was told to me, my mother and my uncle Willard were both 2.5 and 1.5 pounds and were weaned or were put in cotton in a cigar box in a closet to survive, which served as an incubator. And my Uncle Willard grew to be 6'6". So what the size of the child when it's born doesn't seem to matter.
What were the 3 kids' names that came over?
Willard and Ella and Meta, my mother. Meta, Frida, Agnes, Kerner Smith.
Were they in that order? Willard was oldest?
No, mother was the oldest. Willard was the youngest.
Okay.
Then mother was going to school, or she was working as a hairdresser in Omaha. The family came from Germany, from Hamburg, Germany, to Utan, Nebraska, which was a little town outside of Omaha, and is no more. I guess it became part of Omaha. And my dad was going to college in Omaha at the time, and they met. How they met, I'm not sure. But he courted her because she had several things that he gave her while they were courting, such as a silver mirror and a brush and set, and well, that's the only flowers and candy and things. But she often talked about that.
How did, what type of work did they do? Your grandparents, did they do?
My grandfather Otto was a carpenter, and grandmother just raised children, and
So he was a carpenter in Utan?
in Utan also. In fact, he built their house in Omaha that they lived in. They would come up to see us often in Lincoln because they had a car,
Do you know
and
how
Grandpa
long,
was doing very well.
how long they lived to be? How old?
You know, I also have that in the Bible, but I think Grandpa was 70-some and Grandma was 60-some. Grandma died during World War II.
Do you know what they died?
Yes. I believe both of them died of cancer. Grandma did die of cancer of the stomach, and Grandpa of the rectum.
How about your grandparents? Do you remember? One was killed by a bull. How about your grandmother?
Well, I knew her, my mother's mother, very well.
She had
you
a
know.
stroke, didn't she?
But she lived until I was about 20. So,
That would have to be your 80s.
oh yeah,
But wasn't she bedfast the last part of her life?
not very long. Mm-mm.
Do you know what she died of?
No, but she, a stroke, I think. But she lived then after the children were grown. She lived with Uncle Frank a long time. Then he got married. Then she lived with Aunt Grace and helped her raise her 6 children.
And eventually she lived with your mom.
No, never did.
Oh, I was there when she was,
Visiting.
oh,
Hmm.
she was sick when I was there.
Yeah, that's right.
Was your mom, were all three of them born in
Germany, yes.
They were. Okay. I always wondered. I knew that we were
Grandma-
part English and part German, but I didn't know if any of them were from.
Grandma Kerner was pregnant with twins on the boat coming over and lost them when she got here.
Do you know where they landed when they got here?
Yes, they had to stay in Ellis Island for 3 weeks. They were quarantined. There was a smallpox outbreak, I think, and they had to stay there.
And then Nebraska.
Ellis Island is,
In New York, right?
Mhm.
But then to Nebraska.
and then they went to Nebraska. Yeah, I don't
I
know
wonder
if
how they selected them.
I don't know whether their grandpa had some background down in Nebraska or not. I think he just wanted to get as far away as he could, and where that was comfortable to be around other people.
How did they get from like Boston and Ellis Island to Nebraska?
Train, probably.
Is that train? Or?
I'm not sure, but I would imagine horse and buggy or train.
Yeah.
Something I never found out. I don't know whether Jim and Cheryl would know. I'll ask them when they come.
Were all the three of your, like Alice, Gertrude, Frank, and Grace, were they all born in England?
Oh no, they were born in Nebraska.
They were. Okay.
Then my grandmother Smith, Florence, I can't remember her middle name right now, Smith, and William Eskridge Smith, on my father's side, had 8 children, and they were born, 4 of them, I think, were born in a sod house. My father was born in a sod house in Nebraska, and
How many brothers and sisters did you have?
there were 8 altogether, 4 boys and 4 girls.
And that was your dad's son?
Uh-huh.
You know what, Dad? This was on your father's side, right? No, your mother's side, Andrew and.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. 8 kids. My goodness. Where were they from?
Well,
Germany.
Oh no, Grandma Smith was born in Coldwater, Ohio.
Oh, really?
And yes,
Oh.
and she used to laugh about how she was born in Coldwater. She thought that was funny. And Grandpa was from Nebraska somewhere, probably Holbrook.
Do you know where they were originally from? You know, like they had to come from somewhere. Their parents had to come from.
Oh, no, I don't. She says she has Pennsylvania Dutch background.
Oh,
Or she did. So they had been Native Americans for generations.
So that, all right.
Yeah.
How about on your dad's side, Dad?
Well, I should go back and give you a little bit of the history of my dad. When he was a young boy, he went, I suppose, to the 4th or 5th grade. And he used to work for his uncle in Wisconsin. And he delivered milk by dog team, door to door, you know, with a big can, and then you dip the milk and sell it
Wait,
to
what
the
do you mean
people.
dip it?
With a dipper out of a big 10-gallon can, they'd bring their bucket out. You know, it wasn't bottled or anything.
Oh, they just walk out with the bucket, they fill it up with
Yeah.
milk and go back?
And then he'd go to the next house. Anyway, he was an avid reader. He worked in the logging camps. And one time I was telling him I had visited Hurley, Wisconsin. And he says, are the cat houses still there?
Oh.
Because they had been there during the logging days. And Hurley was known for prostitution. But anyway, after that, he went west and he homesteaded. He opened a claim in the Dakotas, and he built his house out of sod, had a sod shanty, and that's how he lived. And
So that was how you, same as your grandparents, or your dad's family. In a sod house, you said 3 of his brothers and sisters?
Are you talking to me?
Yeah, were born in a sod house.
Mhm.
So that was common then.
yeah, because the country wasn't settled.
Well, what do you mean a sod house?
Well,
Grass
Made
on
out
the
of
side of the
sod.
house?
Mhm. Made out of sod.
No wood?
no wood.
How did it stay up?
They stack it like bricks. Sure, they use timber to support it, but you know, snakes would crawl in the rafters and so forth. But the reason they had the sod houses was to protect them from the wind and the rain in the winter.
Okay.
And they'd have a fireplace instead of stoves. That, you know.
Was this before log cabins?
Oh yeah.
Oh, yeah.
That was before log cabins, and in the days of the Indians. My father knew the Indian tribes, Chief Yellow Horse, and the Sioux Indians mostly. And in fact, at one time, he gave me a horsehair bridle that was belonged to the squaw of Yellow Horse's wife.
The squaw
And-
is his wife.
Yeah. Anyway, also a quiver made out of buffalo hide, and I think Randy has that to this day
What's a quiver?
for arrows.
Keep their arrows.
Oh, okay. All right. I remember that.
Yeah.
I've seen that before.
Anyway, then he sold his homestead and moved into Nebraska and had another homestead, and he had cattle, and he brought cream into the cream station. You see, they used to separate the milk, the cream from the milk, and because it would bring more money. And that's how he met my mother. Okay.
My grandparents raised their kids on a farm in Holbrook, Nebraska, and they were able.
Grandparents.
This is my father's parents. They were able to send, I don't know whether they gave them all the opportunity, but 4 of them to college, including my father, which was very unusual for that day and age.
Did they graduate ever? I mean, did any of them?
Ted did, and got a pharmacy license and had a drugstore. I think my father taught school, so I think the equivalent for them was 2 to 3 years to be able to do that. He also talked about when he was going to college about going behind the barn and practicing his speeches because he hated elocution, and he had to get up in front of the class and give speeches, so he practiced on the cows to do this. And one time he got clear up way high on the windmill and couldn't get down, and they had to go after him. And one time the parents took the horse and buggy and went to Arapahoe, which was a day's trip there and back, to buy a grandfather clock, which was to be put on the mantle. It wasn't a freestanding one. And this was a lot of money for them. But they felt they needed this, and kids waited all day. The older sisters babysat the younger ones, and they waited all day for them to come back. And when they came back that night, they ran and jumped in the buggy and jumped on the clock and broke the glass. But my dad loved to tell that story because it was so frustrating for them, but such a natural thing for the kids to do. Okay, 10 seconds?
No.
Okay.
Okay, I wanted to tell you a little bit about my father. He also, when he was a young man, about 20, he was 25. And he was hired by the Trans-Mississippi Grain Company to supervise the building of the grain elevators along the highways as they moved westward. Now, he had never had any formal education in that line, but he learned all about building and so forth by reading. And for a young man 25 years old to supervise a work crew and to build grain elevators was quite a phenomenon. And also, before he was married, he was 40 years old.
Was he a bachelor in
When he got married? No, he'd been married once before, and his wife died at childbirth. So then he didn't marry for a number of years. And in fact, my mother knew her, his first wife.
So did he have...
And no children.
So the baby died at childbirth too?
Yes, the mother and the baby died at childbirth. So also he was superintendent of Sunday school. There's just a lot of things that he learned on his own that, and where he got the motivation, I'll never know. Then, on his homestead, he hired a hired man to help him, and they used to hunt prairie chickens, on a weekend. And he always, yeah,
Prairie chicken.
they're sort of like partridge, yeah, they're. And anyway, he always told the hired man never to put the gun in the wagon loaded. See, they didn't have cars; they used wagons. And The one that was other than a work wagon was called a spring wagon. It was lighter weight and so forth. And so the hard man forgot, and Dad got up into the wagon, and the team started up, and the gun slipped into the corner, and both barrels discharged and went into his side, and the team ran away. Well, and he was bleeding profusely.
How old was he?
Well, I suppose he was in his 30s, early 30s. And he happened to, when you're bleeding, you get very thirsty. And he knew of a spring a quarter of a mile away, and he crawled on his hands and knees to the spring and drank that cold spring water. And the doctor said the closeness of the blast seared a lot of his blood vessels, and his drinking that water saved his life. Then they got him to the hospital, and he was laid up for a long time. I wished I had some of those pictures because it showed him, and he had a dog, a golden retriever dog, that was with him at all times. Anyway, as time went on, then he met my mother.
He was how old when they met?
Well, he was 20 years older than she was. So, I don't know their ages.
But she was probably in her 20s and he was in his...
Yeah. Anyway, they had a child by the name of Frank. They named him Frank. And he died.
What else?
Shortly after child.
You don't know what else?
No. And then later, I was born. And by that time, they had a hog ranch where he raised a lot of hogs and fed them for market. And he had cattle and so forth.
He was a farmer, right?
Yeah. And I was before I was going to school, and one day he found me out in the pig pen, and I was in the hog trough with all these pigs around, and they could have eaten me up. But as luck would have it, he found me in time, so they didn't get to me.
So you were little.
Yeah. Another time.
Would they have eaten you?
Oh, yes. Sure. Then another time, a cow was in the barnyard, and the cow had a little calf, and I was going over toward the calf, and she started after me, and my dad had been splitting wood, and he split her head with an axe, just as she was ready to give me the horns, and killed her in her tracks. That's how close it came.
You were a devil.
Well, also on the same hog ranch, they had guinea pigs, and there were a lot of lilac trees, and these guinea pigs would burrow under the roots and have their babies. They multiply quite
Underground?
Yeah, well, they would multiply rapidly, sort of like rabbits. And they had one of these old washing machines with the arm you pulled back and forth and an agitator. And I caught kittens and put them in that washing machine with water and was going back and forth with...
You didn't like cats, did you?
No, from that day even. Then, another time, there was a creek between the house and the farm buildings and the chicken house and so forth. And so a quick shower came up, a sort of a flash flood, and raised the water in the creek and washed out the footbridge. And I was on the other side, and I had Buster the dog, and I got him in the hen house, and I was sucking him onto the chickens, and the feathers were flying out in the house, and they couldn't get to me. But anyway, they had to wait. They finally called the dog, and the dog had more sense than I did, and he came to Dad. But those were some of the things. This was before I ever started to school.
There's hope for JP.
Anyway, and two, the first time I saw a hen lay an egg, you know, you'd have straw stacks around, and the chickens would make a nest in it. And I saw this chicken with this white coming out of her, you know, and I was down there watching the chicken come out, the egg come out, and my dad stood and watched me, you know, and I didn't know what to make of that.
That would be weird.
But anyway,
When was Grace born then?
well, then after that is when I was in first grade. Well, that's when Dad sold the hog ranch. He had everything. He was ready to retire. That was 1922. So I was born in 16, so that would be 6 years old. And he had bought a business in town and was going to run it. It was a garage for his retirement activity. And we had rented a flat across from the garage because he was going to buy a home. In fact, he had purchased a home and written a check for it. And he walked across that morning by the bank, and it said closed.
Is your sister born?
No, not yet. Anyway, well, I should backtrack. I am backtracking a little bit. In the meantime, a baby girl was added to our family. She was 9 months old.
What was her name?
Her name was Leora. And my mother and I and Leora were visiting my Uncle Frank over in Holt County. And she got sick. And this was in the spring of the year. And they still didn't have a car, so they called my father to meet them at the Niobrara River Bridge.
Do you remember how old you were?
Well, I would probably be 4.5. Anyway, in the spring of the year, the ice, melts and so forth. And this was about 5 miles from where my Uncle Frank lived. And they were getting ready to cross the bridge, and he heard this water rushing. So he said, Gertie, he said, you hold the team here. I'm going to walk ahead and see if it's safe to go across. So he went, and he said, well, if we hurry, he said, I think we can make it. Because the water had just started to go across the bridge. Well, so he got the team, and he used the whip on them, and they ran across the bridge. And just as they got across the bridge, it washed out.
Ooh, and you were on the?
Yeah, and that's how close it came to wiping all of us out. Anyway, shortly after that, then Dad met them, and he had a car at that time, and then they rushed us to the hospital, and Uncle Frank couldn't go back on that bridge. He had to drive about another 20 miles to another bridge to get back home. But anyway, she had, they said, telescoped intestines, where one went inside the other. Today, I guess they can correct that. But anyway, she lost her life. And then this would be about a year later, and I'll get back to just before the bank closed, my father was repairing a fellow's car. And they got in conversation. He said he was from Nebraska Children's Home in Omaha. And he said he was, had children for adoption. And my father said, well, sometime if you'd have a little girl, he said, I think my wife and I'd be interested. And he said, well, that's why I'm here. I said, as soon as you get the car repaired, I'm to pick up a little redheaded girl that's 4 days old. And so Dad right away got a hold of Mother, and he said, if you want, he said, maybe you could see her, maybe you could have her. And so they did. They adopted her.
And that was Grace.
Grace Louise, and she was named after Mother's sister.
And she was wonderful.
Yeah.
Now,
Then-
this was before the bank closed?
Then I'll go into the bank closing.
Your
So
brother then was after?
then my dad walked across to his garage and saw this sign on the door, bank closed. Well, everything he had was in that bank.
This is right after he bought the house.
Yeah, but wait till I give you the rest of the story.
And wasn't he pretty set?
Oh yeah, he was ready to retire
But
and
I mean, he
had
wasn't. You guys were doing pretty well.
they had everything they wanted, anything, and they had in those days to have a car was
After just selling the whole ranch.
yeah. Anyway, he had a lot of the farmers did business with him. He'd been in business about a year and a half, and they always allowed him credit. And so they would pay when they'd sell their crops, So right away he jumped in the car and went from farmer to farmer. He'd say, well, I need some payment on the bill. How much do you have? And if they said $75, he'd say, well, give me $40. Or if it was $200, give me $100. He didn't want them to strip them, because if they'd known the bank was closed, they wouldn't have paid anything, And so he collected about $3,000.
Became very popular.
But they realized he didn't take everything they had.
Yeah.
So he collected about $3,000. Well, the guy that he had written a check to hadn't cashed the check yet. So they didn't have the home. They didn't have anything. So he knew of a cattle feeder that he'd known for years at Ponca, Nebraska, which is about 200 miles from Spencer, where we were at the time.
Wait a second. You mean because he had written a check to the guy for the house and he hadn't cashed it, the bank was closed, and he didn't have the house?
No.
Okay. I didn't know that. All right.
Anyway, then he called him. His name was Peter Behrens, and he was a big cattle feeder. And he knew Dad was reliable, so he said, well, Al, he said, I really don't need somebody right now, but he said, if you come, he said, we'll work out something for you and your family. And so he went ahead, Dad did, and then Mom and I and my Uncle Harry, who was deaf, came later to Ponca. And Mr. Behrens had several farms around that he had tenants on. So when the one opened up, he put my dad on it and gave him a cow and some pigs for payment for his work. And then my parents had a big garden. And that's how he got started again on his own 2 feet.
Your dad's name was
Albert
right?
Elmer.
And how many brothers and sisters?
Well, he had, that I know of, Uncle Ed and a sister Mary. And then he had other brothers, but I never knew them.
Did you mention that Grandpa was 20 years older than Grandma?
Yes, yes, I did. And then he had the sister was married to a fellow by the name of Foy that worked for Alice Chalmers in Milwaukee. So my dad came and visited him one time when Mom and I were living in Milwaukee.
Oh, okay.
Anyway, it took time for him to get back on his feet. And then he started farming for himself. And then he started feeding sheep.
About how old was he now?
Oh, he would be... So, Dad was in his mid-50s by this time. And this was in 1929. And Depression hit. But we had food because we raised it, and we raised beef and pigs. Anyway, he started feeding sheep, and he would go out to Wyoming and maybe buy 3,000 head of sheep, and they would ship them by train to Ponca. Of course, you didn't have any paved roads then. And all the neighbors would join in, and we would drive them out to our farm. And they'd go all across roads, and we had a goat that would lead them. And then he'd turn them loose in the field, and
When you mean the sheep were on the road, they weren't in cars,
No,
trucks.
and they'd
Corral
follow.
them with the horses on the sides.
Yeah, they'd follow this goat because the sheep will follow a leader. And then he'd turn them loose in the fields, and then he had a sheep herder because they would stray if you didn't watch them. And they were not used to corn, so they'd eat all of the foliage along the hedgerow, the fence rows, and all the leaves off the corn stalks and so forth, and be just those ears of corn hanging there. Once they got started eating that corn, why then, boy, he had to put them in a feedlot. Well, the reason you'd buy them, you'd fatten them up, you'd pay so much a pound, you'd fatten them up, and then you'd sell them, and you made the money on the weight that they gained. Well, the bottom fell out, and he had to sell them for about the same amount as he paid for them. So,
He really had a
Now,
rough
how long
time.
had that been the time frame since the bank closed?
that had been, 9 years,
Okay.
or whatever age I was.
Was Uncle Dick here yet?
No. Mm-mm.
How about raise the wheat?
Anyway, I'll tell you another interesting story about the sheep. A sheep is very helpless. And we had a sleet storm in the early fall, and it froze. And these sheep were all on the side hill. And they froze to the ground. And we had to go around and with a corn knife and cut them loose.
Oh my gosh. Their feet froze.
No, they laid down and the wool froze to the
my
ground and they couldn't get up.
Wow.
Well, and,
Pretty stupid.
yeah. Cattle don't lay down like that. But anyway, that's just
Huh.
things that happen that you wouldn't believe.
Now, how old were you approximately now?
Now I'm in the 8th grade.
So that was what, 19... You were 16...
About 19.
26?
No, 32.
Okay. And what kind of car did you have?
At that time, then we had what was called, it was Overland.
Overland?
And our first enclosed car was a Whippet. Was
it an ignition? No, it was a line.
you had to crank it.
Okay.
But anyway, that's another story. I learned to drive at that time, and so we had to drive through a gate to put the car in a shed. And so I told Mother, well, I'll drive through. And so she got out and opened the gate, and I put it in reverse instead, and then there was a side hill right there, and I put it in reverse and started gunned it, and it started backing up, and I turned my wheels, and it was backing up that hill until it killed the engine.
So it killed what?
The engine, you know, it was so steep that...
The engine.
The engine.
So did you have to get a new engine?
Oh, no.
Oh.
No, you just got it out of gear and it rolled back down, and she drove it through then.
No driver's training, huh?
Nope.
But
One thing I have to add here off the subject. I remember Mom saying that Dad was a crybaby. Your mother always said you were a crybaby. And you turned out okay, so Troy, there is still hope for you. Okay.
Isn't that right, Dad?
yeah. Every time she'd get out of my sight, I'd cry about it when I was a baby.
Well, it's ironic that Grandma drives the car faster than he does now.
Well, you know, this could go on and on.
Well, talk about Grace Louise.
All right. Then she was a very nice baby. And
Well, how did you get her? You adopted
Well, I
her.
told you. Then Mother